Hey guys, tonight we begin with a structure, one so massive, so technically absurd, and so unapologetically Roman that it still makes modern engineers squint. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's hazy little history together. If you want to understand the Colosseum, you can't start with architecture journals or engineering diagrams. No, you start with pettiness, Rome's second most abundant natural resource after marble. The Colosseum was not built out of love, civic harmony, or a tender appreciation for the arts. It was built because one emperor wanted to erase the memory of another. The story begins with Nero, the human embodiment of a midlife crisis, who decided that Rome's biggest problem was not famine, corruption, or the occasional fire. It was the lack of a giant private lake for his golden pleasure palace. So he demolished neighborhoods, displaced thousands of people, and built himself a luxury water feature the size of a mall parking lot. Enter Vespasian, a practical man with a practical solution. Destroy Nero's lake, fill it in, build a 50,000-seat murder theatre on top of it. This was the ancient equivalent of deleting your predecessor's entire hard drive and then replacing it with a 4K screensaver of yourself. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't humble. It was Rome's biggest architectural middle finger. By choosing this exact location, Nero's old backyard, Vespasian sent a message. Remember that spoiled maniac who bankrupted Rome? Exactly. Neither do we. The public adored him. Nothing makes people forgive political chaos faster than free entertainment, free food, and front row seats to lions-eating criminals bred in circuses. Still works today. The scale of the project alone was enough to make anyone believe the emperor was compensating for something. Hundreds of thousands of tons of stone, armies of engineers, labourers, quarrymen, and enslaved people, all marshalled to build something that loudly proclaimed, "Rome is back." Construction began around 70 CE. The site had to be stabilised, levelled, drained and packed, because it used to be a lake, a detail the Romans treated with the casual confidence of a civilization that routinely forced nature into submission. Modern architects would spend 6 months writing reports about soil conditions. Rome simply said, drain it and start stacking rocks. In the end, the Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was psychological warfare wrapped in limestone. A political apology, a morale booster, a public distraction, and a power flex all rolled into one enormous ellipse. If other empires built temples to please their gods, Rome built stadiums to please its people, and to erase its mistakes. This wasn't just engineering, this was revenge made of stone. Once Vespasian committed to building the ancient world's biggest revenge project, Rome did what Rome always did. They overperformed. The Colosseum wasn't designed to be impressive, it was designed to make every other civilization feel insecure. Egypt had pyramids? Cute, but those didn't have seat numbers. Greece had theatres? Wonderful, but no one wrestled lions in them. Persia had palaces? Lovely. But could they host a naval battle and a mass execution in the same afternoon? The Romans built the Colosseum with the energy of a civilization that woke up every morning and chose violence and good urban planning. The first step was simple: make it absurdly huge. The Colosseum could hold around 50,000 people, which for the ancient world is basically the equivalent of building a stadium the size of a mid-tier NBA arena and then filling it with 50,000 people who have never heard of deodorant. And Rome didn't just build big, they built fast. Construction began in 70 CE, and by 80 CE, the first spectators were already spilling wine on the seats. Meanwhile, modern construction spends 3 years arguing over permits for a public restroom. But Rome? Drain lake, move rocks, stack rocks, tie rocks together with iron. Done. From the outside, the Colosseum looks like a giant stone wedding cake for people with unresolved aggression issues. 4 stories tall, arches everywhere, columns in 3 different styles, because the Romans couldn't decide on one vibe, so they chose all of them. It was the architectural equivalent of wearing every outfit you own at once and insisting it's fashion. But here's the genius. The Colosseum wasn't just beautiful, it was practical. Those arches weren't decoration. They were load-bearing, stress-distributing, earthquake-resisting pieces of engineering brilliance. Each arch absorbs pressure from the ones beside it, like a team of co-workers taking turns pretending to be productive. The Romans also added vomitoria, those massive tunnel corridors that allowed tens of thousands of spectators to enter and exit in minutes. Yes, vomitoria. No, it does not mean rooms for vomiting. It means passageways that vomit out crowds. Helpful, efficient, and slightly disgusting. A perfect metaphor for the Roman Empire. The Colosseum was more than a stadium. It was a public announcement. Rome is rich, Rome is powerful, Rome is bored, and Rome wants you to know. If you've ever stood in front of the Colosseum and wondered, how is this thing still here while my apartment wall crumbles if I look at it wrong? The answer is Roman concrete, the ancient building material that laughs in the face of time, weather, and structural engineering degrees. Roman concrete didn't behave like our fragile modern cement, the stuff that cracks whenever a squirrel sneezes on it. No, Roman concrete was made with volcanic ash, lime, seawater, and sheer imperial arrogance. It chemically transforms over centuries, developing new crystals that make it stronger as it ages humans. On the other hand, develop back pain and emotional instability. Scientists today study Roman concrete like it's the lost recipe for immortality. Modern engineers gather around samples of this ancient material, poking it with tiny instruments and whispering, "How are you still alive?" Meanwhile, the concrete answers, "Because I wasn't mixed by underpaid contractors with a deadline." The Romans sourced volcanic ash from Pozzuoli, near Naples, because apparently the secret to indestructible architecture is living on a supervolcano. They combined that ash with lime, poured it into wooden molds, and watched it harden into something that could survive earthquakes, fires, riots, invading armies, time, weather, and Milanese tourists carving their initials into everything. The Colosseum's foundation was an enormous concrete ring, 12 meters deep, poured on top of the drained lakebed Nero left behind. And unlike modern construction, which requires 2 years of environmental impact reports and 3 lawsuits, the Romans simply went, "Is it soggy? Yes. Will we build here anyway?" Also, yes, the brilliance of their design wasn't just the materials, it was the method. They built the concrete core first, then wrapped it in layers of travertine limestone blocks, held together with iron clamps. These clamps acted like metal stitches, tying the entire structure into one giant, earthquake-resistant sandwich. And here's the genius part. The Colosseum's concrete isn't one monolithic blob. It's a carefully layered system. Each level designed with slightly different density and flexibility, like the world's first anti-earthquake cake. When tremors hit, the building absorbs the shock instead of collapsing dramatically, like modern parking garages. 2,000 years later, the Colosseum still stands, cracked, scarred, missing a few teeth but stubbornly alive. It ages like an immortal Roman grandmother, indestructible, unimpressed, and silently judging every building around it. If Roman concrete was the muscle of the Colosseum, then the arches were the skeleton. Except unlike your skeleton, this one didn't creak every time it stood up. The Romans didn't just use arches, they weaponized them. They engineered an entire building around the idea that curves are stronger than straight lines, a lesson modern architects apparently forgot sometime around the invention of glass skyscrapers. The Colosseum has 240 exterior arches, each one perfectly shaped, perfectly spaced, and perfectly smug. They form a giant stone ribcage that could survive earthquakes, weather, angry mobs, and 2 millennia of tourists pretending they know what they're looking at. The structure is basically one giant architectural shrug. Gravity? Never heard of her. Here's the genius. Arches distribute weight sideways, not downward. Think of them like stressed Roman senators, always pushing pressure onto the guy next to them. Each arch transfers its load to the one beside it, and that one passes it on until eventually the stress is evenly shared and no one collapses under the burden. It's the exact opposite of how group projects work. Inside, the Romans stacked arches on top of arches, creating 3 full levels of arcades, each decorated with a different column style: Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, because Rome refused to pick a theme. This wasn't architecture, this was flexing in 3 languages. But the magic isn't just aesthetic. Those arches connect to vaults, and those vaults form a honeycomb of corridors, stairs, and support chambers. The whole inner structure looks like someone asked, "How many tunnels can we fit into one building?" And the answer was, yes. This network of arches and vaults created a building that could bend slightly without breaking. Earthquakes shook the Colosseum countless times, but instead of collapsing politely like most ancient structures, it absorbed the vibrations, yawned, and went back to traumatizing spectators. And here's the best part. The Colosseum wasn't even the Romans' first attempt at this kind of structure. They had built smaller amphitheatres before, but this was the final boss version. The amphitheatre that graduated top of its class and then beat up all the other amphitheatres behind the gym today, half the building is missing thanks to medieval stone thieves who treated it like an ancient Home Depot. And yet, even at half strength, the remaining arches still stand firm, ancient, cracked, and more balanced than most people's emotional states. The Romans were many things: engineers, conquerors, philosophers, but above all, they were experts in crowd control. If you can efficiently manage 50,000 people who are hot, hungry, violent, and wearing sandals made from optimism, congratulations, you deserve an empire. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was a human traffic masterpiece. A machine built to swallow tens of thousands of Romans, peasants, nobles, merchants, drunks, pickpockets, senators who pretended they were slumming it, and then spit them all back out in minutes efficiently, safely, without anyone being trampled by an overeager Gladiator fan. The secret? Vomitoria? No, not puke chambers. Despite what the internet says, vomitorium does not mean room for vomiting after overeating grapes. It literally means a place that spews people out. The Romans invented the world's first people fountains. The Colosseum had 80 entrances, each numbered like a modern stadium, because even in 80 CE, someone realized that 50,000 people wandering around asking, "Is this my seat?" would lead to riots. Spectators were assigned tickets, which is adorable when you realize the ticket system was invented for an event where half the participants died. But the genius wasn't just in the entrances, it was in the flow. A complex web of corridors, ramps, staircases, and passageways guided spectators exactly where they needed to be. Wealthy patrons had direct express lanes to the best seats, of course, while the poor were funneled up narrow staircases into the nosebleeds, where they could squint at the carnage and pretend to enjoy it. The Romans were masters of vertical segregation. Rich people sat close enough to smell the gladiators. Poor people sat far enough up to smell the pigeons. And everyone behaved because Rome built the place like a stone maze, where traffic moved smoothly whether people wanted it to or not. That alone was impressive. But what truly sets the Colosseum apart is the exit speed. With its carefully angled corridors and rapid dispersal design, the entire 50,000-person crowd could evacuate the arena in 5 to 10 minutes. 5 to 10 minutes. Modern stadiums, built with computers, algorithms, and fire codes, cannot achieve this. Rome solved crowd flow with arches, concrete, and raw spite. The Colosseum wasn't just a building. It was the prototype for every major stadium, theatre, subway station, and airport terminal design. Since it actually worked. If the arena floor was the Colosseum's face, then the hypogeum, the underground complex beneath it, was its brain, heart, nervous system, and slightly deranged imagination. This hidden world was where the real engineering flex happened. Above, you saw gladiators, animals, and scenery. Below, you saw the ancient Roman version of backstage chaos, except with more chains, less sleep, and significantly higher chances of being eaten by something. The hypogeum was a 2-story labyrinth of tunnels, chambers, cages, ramps, corridors, and machinery. It looked like someone told a Roman engineer, build a dungeon, a zoo, and a theatre backstage, all at the same time, and the engineer responded, say no more. It stretched the entire length and width of the arena floor, a secret hive where hundreds of enslaved workers operated in darkness, guiding animals, prepping gladiators, hauling props, and making sure nothing exploded, or at least exploded at the correct dramatic moment. Here, lions paced restlessly in wooden cages, bears growled in the dark, wolves, boars, leopards, and ostriches waited in cramped stalls, all wondering which genius decided they should be entertainment today. Gladiators moved through these corridors too, sometimes limping, sometimes praying, sometimes staring down a tiger and thinking about changing careers. The whole place trembled with the sound of mechanisms creaking, animals snarling, and men shouting over each other like an ancient Roman production crew, desperately trying to keep a show on schedule. The machinery itself was astonishing. Wooden elevators powered by counterweights and human labour, lots of human labour, could lift entire cages or entire scenery sets straight through the arena floor. Imagine being a gladiator, standing in pitch blackness on a platform, hands shaking, while a dozen slaves above pull ropes that groan like dying oxen. Then suddenly the platform shoots upward, the trapdoor bursts open, and you're in the sun, surrounded by 50,000 screaming Romans who expect you to fight something that also wishes it weren't here. It wasn't just animals and fighters. Sometimes the hypogeum crew lifted entire miniature forests, trees, rocks, even fabricated hills to make the arena look like different environments. A flat sand floor in the morning could become a wild woodland by noon. It was scenic design, centuries before theatre directors learned to yell at interns. Walking through the hypogeum must have felt like stepping into a fever dream. The heat, the noise, the smell of wood, sweat, straw, and fear blending together. It was organised chaos. Mostly organised, often chaotic, always dangerous. If the Colosseum was Rome's showpiece, the hypogeum was the engine room. Hidden, complex, and absolutely unhinged. If there is one part of the Colosseum that truly makes modern engineers sit down, breathe heavily, and reconsider their career choices, it's the elevators, yes. Elevators. Not metaphorical ones. Actual platforms designed to lift animals, scenery, and sometimes very confused gladiators straight through the arena floor. This was the 1st century. No electricity, no hydraulics, no steel cables, just wood, rope, counterweights, muscle, and the kind of problem-solving energy you only get when the Emperor demands a surprise tiger entrance, and you can't say no because, well, he's the Emperor. The system was almost comically overcomplicated. Dozens of vertical shafts were positioned under the wooden arena floor, each containing a platform attached to a complex assembly of pulleys and winches. These were powered by groups of enslaved workers cranking massive capstans, basically oversized hamster wheels for humans. Each lift required 8 to 12 men, all working in perfect synchronization, because if one guy got tired, the entire platform jerked sideways, and suddenly your dramatic lion reveal turned into an OSHA violation. Imagine the scene: a lion pacing in a dark cage, twitching with adrenaline. The platform beneath it begins to rise, creaking like a haunted barn door. Slaves grunt and sweat below, pulling ropes thicker than your wrist. The trapdoor above bursts open with impeccable timing. Sunlight hits the lion's face, and 50,000 Romans collectively gasp, "Ooh!" like they're watching an ancient surprise party, except the surprise wants to bite someone's head off. This wasn't engineering. This was controlled catastrophe. The lifts weren't used just for animals. Gladiators made entrances through them too, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, sometimes surrounded by scenery like trees, rocks, or the world's saddest imitation of a forest. These dramatic reveals were planned with the precision of a Broadway musical and the mortality rate of a chainsaw juggling act. Everything depended on coordination. One mistimed rope could send a platform crashing back down into the darkness. And history tells us the Romans were not particularly forgiving when expensive animals or valuable fighters got dropped like sacks of grain. The workers below lived in a constant state of stress, knowing that every performance was one snapped rope away from turning the hypogeum into a flattened zoo. And yet, the system worked, smoothly, repeatedly, impressively. These elevators fired off hundreds of flawless cues during games, proving that the Romans weren't just good at building stuff. They were good at making stuff move. The Colosseum didn't just show violence, it staged it, choreographed it, and lifted it dramatically into view. Just when you think the Romans couldn't possibly make the Colosseum any more unhinged, they decided to do something that sounds like a fever dream. They flooded it completely, intentionally, repeatedly. This wasn't a plumbing accident or a weather-related incident. No, this was a deliberate engineering choice by people who looked at the world's largest amphitheatre and said, "You know what would improve this? Boats." These staged sea battles, called naumachii, were Rome's way of saying, yes, we conquered half the known world, but we also want to watch tiny ships ram into each other for entertainment. Flooding the arena required a level of hydraulic engineering that still makes modern civil engineers stare at diagrams and whisper, how? Aqueduct channels were routed into the arena through underground pipes, allowing the entire floor to fill with water deep enough for specially designed flat-bottomed ships. And because the Romans loved a dramatic gesture, they didn't just flood it slowly. They filled it with the theatrical impatience of a civilization that invented indoor plumbing specifically to flex. The transformation was quick. One moment, the arena was a sandy battlefield. The next, it was a shimmering lake. Props floated. Miniature islands bobbed. Even the roar of the crowd shifted, from bloodlust to delighted confusion. "Are we sailing today?" "Yes, Marcus, we are. Sit down." The battles themselves were pure spectacle. Prisoners of war or condemned criminals were forced to reenact famous naval conflicts, which was probably the world's earliest and darkest form of historical cosplay. Small wooden ships crashed into each other, while thousands of Romans cheered from the stands, enjoying the kind of entertainment that would give modern insurance companies a heart attack. But this aquatic madness came at a cost. Waterlogging the arena repeatedly was terrible for the wooden flooring, the substructure, the hypogeum, the staff, and probably the general morale of anyone responsible for cleanup. Eventually, the Romans realized that operating a pop-up lake inside a stone building was expensive, impractical, and created mold that probably had opinions. So the practice faded out as fast as it began. Still, for a brief, glorious moment, the Colosseum wasn't just a theatre of blood. It was a marine park, a giant stone bathtub of imperial arrogance, a swimming pool sponsored by the Roman treasury and fueled by questionable decision-making. Rome didn't just build a stadium. It built a venue capable of hosting a football match, a naval battle, and an existential crisis, all before lunchtime. If the Romans had one weakness, it was that they didn't know when to stop. They couldn't just have animals, gladiators, and giant naval battles. No. They also needed scenery. Dramatic scenery. Scenery that rose magically from the ground like a theatre stage managed by a team of caffeinated demigods. The Colosseum wasn't a stadium. It was an ancient special effects studio, centuries before Hollywood learned how to blow things up on purpose. Beneath the arena floor, inside the hypogeum's labyrinth of tunnels and platforms, sat a collection of wooden frames, painted backdrops, portable forests, artificial rocks, and the world's earliest set decorations. When the Romans wanted to transform the battlefield into a desert, a woodland, or a miniature mountain range, all they had to do was attach the props to the elevators, cue the backstage workers, and voila, instant scenery. Imagine being a gladiator, squinting in the darkness below, only to be lifted into the arena surrounded by a plastic-looking forest built with the craftsmanship of a man who hasn't slept in 3 days. Meanwhile, the audience gasps like they're witnessing divine intervention. In reality, they're witnessing the blood, sweat, and tears of an entire workforce running on stale bread and fear. These scenery lifts were part of the same elevator network used for animals and fighters. One minute the arena might look like a flat sandy floor. The next, a lush forest pops up, complete with shrubs, fake trees, and the occasional real tree that someone stole from a nearby villa. The Romans didn't care about accuracy. They cared about spectacle. If it looked vaguely like nature, that was good enough for them. Some lifts even supported life-sized props, like small huts or miniature temples, for elaborately staged mythological reenactments. Condemned criminals were often forced into these performances, playing heroes like Orpheus or Hercules. These reenactments always ended the same way, very badly for the actor. Call it ancient method acting. The engineering precision required for these scenic changes was astonishing. Everything had to align perfectly. The trapdoors, the platforms, the timing, the actors, the wild animals occasionally escaping their cages, an entire production balanced on the edge of disaster. And yet the Romans pulled it off repeatedly, creating the illusion of magic long before stagecraft had a name. For the audience, it was a dazzling display. For the workers underground, it was probably pure chaos. But for Rome, it was another triumph. Proof that if you gave them a giant arena, they would fill it with everything except basic restraint. If you've ever visited Rome in summer, you know the sun doesn't shine. It assaults you. It melts you. It turns you into a human raisin within 4 minutes. Now imagine sitting in that heat with 50,000 other sweaty Romans, all packed together like olives in a jar, waiting for a gladiator show to start. The Romans knew their crowds would riot if they were left to broil alive, so they invented something that sounds completely fictional. The Valerium, a giant retractable sunshade covering roughly 2/3 of the Colosseum. This wasn't a cute little canvas tarp. This was a massive network of sails, ropes, pulleys and masts, so large and complicated that only one group in the empire had enough experience to operate it. The Imperial Navy, yes. Rome used actual sailors to provide shade. Imagine telling a naval commander, "Ah yes, your new assignment is not fighting pirates, but adjusting a giant umbrella for sweaty civilians." These were men trained for maritime warfare, now hoisting what is essentially the world's oldest beach tent. The Valerium worked by attaching enormous sailcloth panels to a framework of wooden poles anchored around the top of the Colosseum. Sailors maneuvered ropes that stretched across the entire amphitheatre like a giant spiderweb. When fully extended, the Valerium filtered sunlight, reduced heat, and even directed breezes downward into the stands. In other words, ancient Rome invented stadium climate control, and they did it using the same people who normally commanded warships. Talk about overqualified. But operating the Valerium was a logistical nightmare. Every time the wind picked up, the entire system threatened to transform into a deadly parachute. A sudden gust could snap ropes, bend timbers, or yank sailors off platforms. Running the Valerium required hundreds of men, perfect timing, constant communication, and the willingness to risk being catapulted across the arena if things went wrong. Yet somehow, the Romans made it look effortless. Spectators enjoyed shade, breezes, and reduced glare while watching lions maul criminals. The Valerium even helped with acoustics, diffusing sound and softening the roar of the crowds. It wasn't just practical, it was a statement. Look what we can do with fabric, rope, and an unhealthy obsession with public comfort. Modern stadiums have multi-million-dollar retractable roofs. Rome had sailors, pulleys, and vibes. And honestly, the sailors did a better job. One of the most overlooked engineering feats of the Colosseum wasn't the elevators, the trapdoors, or the ability to flood itself on command. It was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. Sound. The Colosseum wasn't just built to entertain people. It was built so 50,000 Romans could hear every scream, roar, shout, and last-minute plea to the gods with perfect clarity. The Romans understood something modern stadium designers still struggle with. Crowds want to hear things. They want to hear armor clashing, lions snarling, the crunch of sand under a gladiator's feet, and occasionally the unsettling sound of something very large and very angry being released from a cage. The Colosseum delivered all of this with the precision of a natural amplifier. The secret was its oval shape, a design that funneled sound inward and upward. Every noise filled the arena like a bowl of acoustic soup, a mixture of cheers, gasps, and the universal Roman chant for "Hit him again." The elliptical form prevented echoes from scattering, bouncing the sounds directly toward the audience. Even the poor souls in the nosebleed seats could hear the sharp intake of breath from a gladiator about to make a terrible life decision. But shape alone wasn't enough. The Romans built the stands and passages using vaults and arches that channeled sound waves efficiently. Stone corridors acted as resonating chambers, amplifying reactions from the crowd into a stadium-wide rumble. Imagine 50,000 Romans shouting at once. Now imagine that sound getting boosted by architecture. Terrifying? Yes. Effective? Absolutely. The velarium also played a role. When extended, the massive canopy acted like a sound diffuser, softening harsh echoes and bouncing noise back into the arena. Modern acoustic engineers study this system, often while questioning their life choices. The velarium helped create a surprisingly even sound profile, allowing spectators to hear the show no matter where they sat. And perhaps more importantly, it prevented the emperor's delicate ears from being overwhelmed by chaotic echoes. Nothing ruins a good execution like bad acoustics. Even the arena floor contributed to the soundscape. Beneath the wooden planks was the hypogeum, whose chambers created a subtle reverberation effect. Every stomp, roar, and impact carried with a theatrical intensity Rome would never admit was intentional, but absolutely was. The Colosseum wasn't just a theatre of violence. It was an early experiment in audio engineering, designed so every spectator could hear the exact moment someone regretted signing up to be a gladiator. When you cram 50,000 Romans into a giant stone bowl on a summer afternoon, most of whom bathe only when Jupiter personally demands it, you have a problem. A ventilation problem. The air is starting to taste like human soup problem. Any normal ancient civilization would simply accept the suffering. But Rome? Rome looked at the situation and said, "No, we will engineer our way out of this smell." And somehow, they did. The Colosseum had a shockingly sophisticated ventilation system, one that modern architects pretend not to have feelings about. The entire structure was designed to breathe air was pulled in through the ground-level arches, funneled upward through corridors and staircases, and released out the top like a giant stone chimney. Hot air rose naturally. Cool air drifted in below. It was convection on a heroic scale, powered by nothing more than physics, and the collective hope that the man sitting next to you wouldn't faint from heatstroke. The design of the seating tiers also played a role. Each level of arches acted like a massive wind funnel, catching breezes and circulating them through the interior. The effect wasn't air conditioning, let's not pretend, but it kept the place from turning into a sweaty death trap. The Romans didn't know the word venturi effect, but they built it into half their buildings anyway, because they were overachievers with access to volcanic ash. And then there was the velarium, the giant sunshade. Besides keeping spectators alive, it also helped direct air downward into the stands. When extended, it behaved like a massive sail catching wind. Sailors adjusted the ropes to angle the canopy just right. Too flat, and it blocked airflow, too angled, and you basically created a kite big enough to pull the Colosseum into the Tiber. The stakes were high. Even the hypogeum contributed to airflow. All those tunnels, chambers, and passageways under the arena created natural drafts that pushed air upward through the trapdoors. During games, the floor itself became a kind of ventilation grate, allowing cooler underground air to blend with the warm air above. Granted, the air rising from the hypogeum often carried the scent of animals, sweat, wood, and mild despair, but it was still airflow. The result was a stadium that never fully suffocated its spectators. Even on days when the weather, the crowd, and the games all conspired to do exactly that, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't luxurious. But it worked. Rome didn't just manage airflow. Rome domesticated it. One of the great cosmic jokes of history is that the Colosseum has survived nearly 2,000 years of earthquakes, invasions, lightning strikes, vandalism, time, gravity, and teenagers carving their initials into stone. Yet your modern apartment building gets cracks if someone upstairs sneezes too hard. The difference isn't magic. It's that the Romans built the Colosseum like they expected the earth itself to attack them, which, in fairness, it did frequently. Rome sits in a seismically active region, but the Romans refused to see earthquakes as a construction problem. They saw them as a design challenge, so they created a structure that didn't just endure tremors, it coexisted with them. The secret was flexibility. Not emotional flexibility, of course. Romans were famously terrible at that structural flexibility. The Colosseum's skeleton of arches, vaults, and radial walls formed an interlocking network that could absorb shockwaves like a giant stone shock absorber. When earthquakes hit, and they hit a lot, the forces dispersed through this web of supports rather than concentrating in one catastrophic spot. Modern engineers call this distributed stress response. The Romans called it just another Tuesday. The foundation was equally genius. Beneath the arena lies a massive ring of concrete, 12 meters thick, reinforced with stones, and designed to grip the earth like a stubborn grandmother refusing to leave her favorite chair. This foundation wasn't rigid. It had enough give to shift slightly without cracking. Think of it as ancient anti-earthquake memory foam, except it was made from volcanic ash and pure engineering confidence. Iron clamps held the massive exterior blocks together, acting like skeletal tendons that kept the whole structure unified. Instead of using mortar, which cracks under pressure, the Romans used metal to bind their stone. Medieval builders later stole many of these clamps for weapons and tools, contributing to the Colosseum's broken shape today. The building didn't collapse because the earthquakes were too strong. It collapsed because medieval Italians saw free iron and made executive decisions. Even with missing sections and centuries of damage, the Colosseum still stands. Half of it is gone, yet the remaining half refuses to fall. It's like a boxer who lost an eye, 3 teeth, and most of his ribs, but insists on finishing the fight. Rome didn't just design a building. It designed a survivor, a stone titan that learned to sway, bend, absorb, and outlive the very ground shaking beneath it. For all its engineering brilliance, the arches, the elevators, the ventilation, the naval battles nobody asked for, the Colosseum had another purpose, one far more subtle and far more powerful. Psychological warfare. This wasn't just a stadium. It was an empire-sized intimidation device disguised as entertainment. The Colosseum told every spectator exactly one thing. Rome is strong, not Rome is beautiful, or Rome is prosperous. No. The message was, Rome has money, manpower, and enough lions to fill a moderately sized airport. And if you step out of line, guess who gets feeding time? Everything about the structure was designed to showcase Rome's dominance. Its size alone dwarfed every other amphitheatre ever built. Approaching it must have felt like approaching a stone monster, towering, elliptical, and silently judging your fashion choices. The exterior was lined with massive statues of gods, heroes, and emperors, each one carefully selected to remind you that Rome created greatness and could uncreate you just as easily. Once inside, the fear machine got even smarter. Seating was arranged by social class, a vertical reminder of the Roman hierarchy. Senators and elites sat close to the action, practically inhaling the gladiators' sweat. Commoners perched high in the nosebleeds, looking down at the spectacle like ants observing other ants fighting slightly angrier ants. Slaves, foreigners, and the socially disposable stood at the very top, probably wondering why they came at all. And then came the shows, each one meticulously curated to remind the audience of Rome's absolute control over everything. Exotic animals were paraded in from conquered lands, proving the empire's reach. Naval battles reenacted Rome's victories. Executions dramatized the fate of criminals and rebels. Gladiator duels celebrated strength, discipline, and skill. Traits Rome insisted it embodied, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The sheer logistics of these events communicated a terrifying level of competence. A government capable of importing tigers from halfway across the world just to throw them at a guy with a spear is a government you do not rebel against. The Colosseum's message was simple. Look what we can do for entertainment. Imagine what we can do when we're actually mad. Even the Emperor's presence reinforced the fear. On game days, he sat in the Imperial box, a literal throne built into the arena, visible to tens of thousands of citizens. Every cheer, every gasp, every scream echoed upward to him. It was impossible not to feel the weight of Rome's authority. So yes, the Colosseum was an architectural marvel, but it was also a tremor in stone, a reminder that Rome ruled not just through roads and armies, but through psychology, spectacle, and calibrated fear. By all laws of nature, physics, probability, and common sense, the Colosseum should not still be here. It should have collapsed centuries ago, quietly dissolving into dust like a responsible ancient building. But the Colosseum is not responsible. It is petty, stubborn, and powered by the lingering soul of a civilization that refused to admit defeat even when it was collapsing dramatically. So, instead of dying gracefully, the Colosseum chose immortality. Earthquakes have struck Rome repeatedly, cracking walls, tearing arches apart, and sending chunks of stone plummeting to the streets below. Medieval builders looted its marble and iron clamps to build churches, fortifications, fountains, and probably a few houses for people who really wanted to impress their neighbours. The Colosseum lost entire sections of its facade, its interior seating, its flooring, and all its decoration. Yet the remaining structure still stands like a wounded giant refusing to lie down. For centuries, it served every purpose except the one it was built for. It became a fortress for rival medieval families, a quarry for building materials, a Christian shrine, a marketplace, a shelter, a dumping ground, and eventually a tourist attraction where people take selfies in sandals that cost more than the average Roman earned in a month. Through it all, the Colosseum remained, scarred, hollow, but indestructible. What's left today is only a fragment of the original building. But even that fragment is larger, grander, and more structurally sound than most modern stadiums. You could flatten the Colosseum, drop it into the earth, set it on fire, and it would probably just shrug, re-solidify, and become a new kind of landmark. It simply refuses to die. Its longevity is partly due to Roman engineering brilliance, the concrete, the arches, the foundation. But there's something deeper, something almost emotional. The Colosseum became more than a building. It became an icon, a symbol of human ambition, cruelty, innovation, and resilience. Every stone carries the memory of a civilization that dreamed absurdly big and built structures that matched those dreams. Standing before it today, you can feel the weight of history pressing in from every angle. You see what Rome was, what it became, and what it left behind. The city around it has changed 1,000 times, but the Colosseum remains, watching centuries pass like a bored emperor, waiting for the next performance. Rome didn't build the Colosseum to last forever, but the Colosseum didn't care. It decided to last anyway. In the early Middle Ages, armour was a simple equation. Metal on body equals slightly higher chance of not dying. Nobody cared if it sparkled, matched your horse's saddle, or made you look slimmer around the waist. Survival, not style, was the priority. But as Europe moved into the 13th and 14th centuries, something remarkable and very human began to happen. Knights, who were essentially tanks with social status, started caring about how they looked inside those tanks. Suddenly, armour wasn't just equipment. It was identity, ego, and a medieval version of drip. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began subtly, with small engraved lines along helmets or a decorative rivet pattern on a breastplate. Then those small flourishes became bolder. Etched vines crawled across steel. Lions, griffins, swords, and religious symbols were hammered, chiseled, and inlaid into the metal. A knight could walk onto a battlefield and be recognized instantly, not by his face, which was hidden, but by the artistic signature of the armour he wore. And make no mistake, medieval nobles loved being recognised. Why win a battle anonymously when you could win it looking like the final boss in a fantasy game? By the late Middle Ages, armour-making workshops had become part smithy, part fashion house. Master armourers in places like Milan, Augsburg, and Nuremberg became celebrities in their own right. If you were wealthy, you didn't just buy armour, you commissioned a masterpiece. Families treated their suits like heirloom jewellery, badges of honour that displayed lineage, wealth, and personal mythology. A knight's armour could communicate loyalty through heraldic symbols, intimidation through monstrous engraving, or pure vanity through polished steel so reflective you could fix your hair in it. Of course, with all this personalisation came competition. Knights judged each other's armour the way modern celebrities judge each other's red carpet outfits. A plain, undecorated suit might protect your ribs just fine, but socially it said, "I am a background character." So the noble class escalated the game gold inlay, blackened steel, blued metal, embossed figures, even tiny saints hammered into vambraces, all became part of the medieval fashion arms race. By the time full plate armour reached its peak, knights weren't just fighters. They were walking galleries of metal craftsmanship, each step clanking with pride, ego, and very expensive taste. Armour had finally become fashion. As armour became increasingly decorative, a new kind of medieval celebrity emerged, the master armourer. These weren't just blacksmiths with muscles and soot-stained aprons. By the 14th and 15th centuries, they were artisans, equal parts engineer, metalsmith, and fashion designer. And like all good designers, they had signatures, styles, and loyal noble clients who refused to be seen in anything less than their work. Take Milan, for example. The Italian city became the Paris of medieval armour. The Misaglia and Negroli families produced suits that were so beautiful, some knights practically wanted to lose battles just so the enemy could admire their breastplate up close. The Italian approach favoured smooth, elegant curves, high polish, and subtle engraving, the medieval equivalent of minimalist luxury. Showy, but in a tasteful, "Yes, my armour did cost more than your castle" kind of way. Then there was Germany, home to Gothic armour, all sharp lines, fluting, and intimidating ridges. German armour looked like it had been designed by someone who loved architecture but hated the people inside buildings. It was bold, dramatic, and almost aggressively stylish. And it wasn't just pretty. Fluting added structural strength, letting plates be lighter without sacrificing durability. Form, in this case, actually improved function, something knights loved, because nobody wants their armour to collapse the moment someone pokes them with a halberd. These master armourers signed their work, kept pattern books, and passed down secret techniques like family recipes. Some were so famous that nobles waited months or years for commissions. Imagine being a duke and telling your troops, "No campaign this summer, my new cuirass isn't ready." And honestly, nobody would have judged him. The quality justified the delay. But the real magic of these artisans was how they blended beauty with lethality. A Milanese breastplate might be etched with saints and angels, but it could still deflect a longbow arrow. A German Gothic gauntlet might have dramatic finger ridges, but it still crushed someone's helmet effectively. The best armour balanced aesthetics with survival, proving that medieval people could love fashion without forgetting the very real possibility of being stabbed by the 15th century. Master armourers were so prestigious that entire courts revolved around their workshops. Patronage flowed, rivalries grew, innovation thrived, and knights? They walked into battle feeling like models on a very dangerous runway, knowing their armour wasn't just forged, it was crafted. If armour was the medieval version of designer fashion, heraldry was the logo. The bold, unmistakable branding splashed across every shield, helm, and surcoat. Before the age of literacy, Snapchat filters, or even standardized uniforms, heraldry solved a very practical problem. How do you identify someone whose face is hidden behind steel plates and whose body is moving at full speed on a warhorse? The answer was simple. You turn the knight into a walking family billboard. Heraldry wasn't random decoration. Every symbol, colour, and pattern carried meaning. Lions stood for courage, eagles for imperial authority, fleur-de-lis for purity, and sometimes families chose oddly specific things like 3 dead fish because medieval nobles were terrible at graphic design. But whatever the symbol, it was uniquely tied to a lineage. When a knight charged into battle, he brought centuries of ancestry with him. Like wearing your entire family history as a coat, the crest on a helmet was especially important. Some knights went subtle, a small carved animal or a simple plume of dyed feathers. Others went for maximum chaos. There were helms with full-sized wooden dragons, snarling boar heads, giant wings, and even miniature castles. Imagine galloping into battle with a 3-foot wooden swan glued to your head practical. No. Iconic? Absolutely. And while heraldry helped identify allies on chaotic fields, it also became a crucial part of knightly fashion. A well-designed coat of arms elevated a warrior's presence. It declared wealth, because only the rich could afford dye, embroidery, and repeat orders for capes that burst into flames if you stood too close to a torch. It declared loyalty. The colours of one's liege lord often appeared somewhere on the gear, and it declared personality. Bold knights chose bright red or gold, while brooding, main character energy ones tended to choose blacks, blues, and ominous animals that looked like they wanted to bite someone. Heraldry extended beyond the armour itself. Horses were draped in matching caparisons, turning knight and mount into one coordinated fashion statement. Shields became canvases, sometimes so artistically detailed that losing one in battle was like losing a luxury handbag. Even lances carried heraldic pennons that waved dramatically in the wind, announcements of status, confidence, and occasionally delusional self-esteem. By the late Middle Ages, heraldry had become inseparable from the identity of a knight. Armour protected the body, but heraldry projected the soul, or at least the family's preferred PR version of it. Combined, they turned medieval warriors into living symbols, instantly recognizable in a world where recognition was everything. Once armour had become a medieval fashion statement, knights sought new ways to elevate it from functional but respectable to so beautiful the enemy hesitates before stabbing you. Enter the flourishing world of etching, gilding, bluing, and inlay. The decorative techniques that transformed plain steel into metallic art. These were not quick touches. They required skill, chemistry, steady hands, and an owner who didn't mind spending the equivalent of a small village's annual income to look spectacular. Etching began as the star technique. Armourers used acid to carve patterns into steel, creating detailed images that would have made Renaissance painters sigh with jealousy. Scrollwork, floral motifs, geometric bands, saints, mythic beasts, all became fair game. And because medieval nobles had zero sense of moderation, they often requested all of these at once. A single breastplate might feature spiraling vines, fierce lions, and angels dramatically pointing swords at demons who looked suspiciously like political enemies, but etching wasn't enough. Knights wanted shine, contrast, and something that would catch the sunlight during a joust like a medieval paparazzi flash, so gold and silver inlay entered the scene. This process involved hammering precious metal into carved grooves, tedious, expensive, and entirely unnecessary for surviving a battlefield, which is exactly why nobles loved it. Nothing said, "I am important," like armour that glittered every time you moved. A knight turning his torso could light up half the tournament ground. Bluing was another favourite, a method of heating steel until it turned a deep, rich cobalt colour. Not only did this look stunning, but it also helped prevent rust fashion meeting practicality. A rare phenomenon, but it happened. Black and gold armour in particular became iconic. Imagine a warrior stepping forward in midnight blue plate, trimmed in glowing gold. Intimidating? Yes. Historically accurate? Absolutely. The Burgundian court practically made it their dress code. Embossing pushed things further. Instead of carving into the metal, armourers hammered out shapes from the inside, raising figures in relief. Suddenly, armour featured three-dimensional dragons, muscular saints, and swirling fabrics sculpted from steel. It was the medieval version of wearing haute couture, if haute couture weighed 60 pounds and could stop an arrow. By the 15th century, decorated armour wasn't just equipment, it was a luxury commodity. Knights didn't just wear steel, they wore status, artistry, and the medieval equivalent of a flex. While battlefield armour needed to be practical, flexible, durable, and capable of shrugging off sharp metal flying at high speeds, tournament armour followed a completely different philosophy. Look incredible, impress everyone, and avoid dying as a bonus. Tournaments were the medieval equivalent of massive sporting events, mixed with fashion shows, political networking, and ego exhibitions. And if you showed up wearing plain steel, you might as well have arrived barefoot. Tournament armour was thicker, heavier, and often wildly more decorated than anything worn in war. Why? Because in tournaments, aesthetics mattered. You weren't fighting for survival. You were fighting for prestige, attention, and ideally the admiration of nobles watching from the stands. Knights wanted armour that would dazzle a crowd from 50 yards away. Imagine a runway model, but the runway involves horses, lances, and the occasional concussion. The joust was the centrepiece of these fashion spectacles. Knights commissioned special helms with exaggerated visors, massive crests, and bold colours. Some helmets were barrel-shaped, designed to deflect lances, but also designed to make you look like a walking armoured monument. Many were painted in brilliant hues or adorned with fabric mantling that whipped dramatically in the wind. Practical? Barely. Dramatic? Absolutely essential. Then there were the crests, towering sculptures worn on top of helmets during parades and presentations. These weren't small decorations. We're talking giant wings, roaring beasts, gilded crowns, and in some cases full miniature landscapes. One German tournament helm featured a sculpted lion so large it probably created aerodynamic drag. But that was the point. In tournaments, size did matter, and subtlety was considered a tragic personality flaw. Tournament armours were also highly themed. A knight might design a suit around his heraldry, his family mythology, or even a personal motto. One might arrive wearing armour etched with saints blessing his lance. Another might choose a dragon motif to appear fierce and mystical. Another might incorporate hearts, vines, and romantic symbols in a desperate attempt to look appealing to that one noblewoman in the spectator box. These suits were often too heavy or too specialised for war. They were tailored to specific tournament events, foot combat, jousting, or melee fighting. Each discipline had unique design requirements, which only fueled the arms race of customization. The wealthiest nobles kept entire wardrobes of tournament gear, switching suits the way modern athletes switch jerseys. In tournaments, armour wasn't just protection, it was theatre. Not all armour was meant for war, and not all armour was meant for tournaments. Some armour existed for a far more delicate, deeply medieval purpose, standing around looking important during ceremonies. Coronations, royal entries, weddings, diplomatic receptions, religious festivals. Any event with powerful people and an audience required knights and nobles to appear in full regalia. And that regalia often included armour so ornate, so extravagant, and so wildly impractical that it had no business being anywhere near a battlefield. Ceremonial armour was designed to say something before the wearer even opened his mouth. I am wealthy. I am noble. I am powerful. And yes, I spent more on this suit than the average town makes in a decade. This type of armour was typically lighter than battlefield plate but heavier in decoration. Gold leaf, silver applique, raised embossing, velvet underpadding, and enamel accents were common. Some suits had so much precious metal layered onto them that they could be classified somewhere between military equipment and portable bank vault. The Milanese and German workshops excelled at these showpieces, crafting breastplates with three-dimensional cherubs, pauldrons shaped like mythic beasts, and helmets sculpted into faces that stared down onlookers with the emotional range of a bored demigod. These suits also served political purposes. When a noble processed through a city wearing ceremonial armour, it was a statement of stability, dominance, and heritage. The armour communicated legitimacy. My family has been here for generations. My ancestors fought in these lands. And this 10-pound gold eagle on my shoulder? That's our family symbol, so please be impressed. Foreign envoys were greeted by guards in matching ceremonial armour sets, coordinated, polished, and designed to intimidate. You weren't just entering a court, you were entering a world where the elite literally shimmered. Kings loved such displays. Charles V, Maximilian I, Henry VIII, all commissioned suits that were essentially wearable propaganda, designed to burn an image into the minds of subjects and rivals alike. Unlike tournament armour, ceremonial suits favoured mobility over defence. After all, the worst danger a knight faced at a royal wedding was tripping on a stone stair or being stuck in conversations with people he despised. But despite lacking battlefield toughness, these suits were crafted with astonishing precision. Artisans spent months perfecting the symmetry of patterns that most spectators would only glimpse from a distance. Ceremonial armour didn't save lives. It shaped reputations. One of the most fascinating parts of medieval armour as fashion is how dramatically it changed depending on where you lived. Armour wasn't just armour. It was cultural identity hammered into steel. A knight from Italy looked nothing like a knight from Germany, and a French noble could be spotted by his silhouette alone. If modern countries argue about who makes the best luxury brands, medieval Europe did the exact same thing, only with armour that could deflect a spear. Italy, for starters, was the Milan of Milanese armour, literally. Italian armour was sleek, elegant, and beautifully contoured. The Milanese workshops mastered smooth, rounded surfaces that gave their suits a polished, almost fluid appearance. Even the practical elements looked refined. Italians had a talent for making armour that whispered, "Yes, I can kill you, but I'll look fabulous while doing it." Their breastplates shone like mirrors. Their helmets flowed into graceful curves. It was armour with aristocratic confidence. Germany, meanwhile, took a completely different route. Gothic armour was angular, dramatic, and almost architectural. Tall ridges, deep fluting, pointed sabatons. Everything looked like it belonged in a cathedral built by someone in a very intense mood. German armourers didn't care about soft curves. They cared about structure, intimidation, and steel shaped like it was carved from dark stone. A German knight didn't just walk, he loomed. Fluting also made armour stronger, so these intimidating designs had real engineering behind them. Leave it to the Germans to make something terrifying and structurally efficient. France, as usual, sat somewhere between elegance and showmanship. Parisian and Tours workshops produced armour with tasteful ornamentation, clean lines, and excellent craftsmanship without the extremes of Italian sleekness or German Gothic flair. French armour was the medieval equivalent of effortless style, refined but never loud, fashionable but never desperate. Knights at the French court preferred armour that suggested nobility without screaming it from the rooftops. England developed its own style too, influenced heavily by both German and Italian imports. English knights favoured practicality blended with selective luxury. They adopted decorative trends, but tended to avoid the more dramatic flourishes. That said, wealthy English nobles like the Black Prince embraced ornate blackened armour with gold accents. The medieval version of a perfectly tailored black suit with flashy cufflinks. Even Spain and Eastern Europe had distinct identities. Spanish armour often featured bold etching and gilding, while Polish hussars later added wings, because apparently armour wasn't dramatic enough. In every region, armour wasn't simply protection. It was geography turned fashion. By the late Middle Ages, knights didn't just wear armour, they curated it. Personalisation became so widespread that no two suits looked exactly alike. Armour wasn't mass-produced, it was tailored, sculpted, and decorated according to the owner's preferences, personality, and sometimes unhinged artistic vision. If a knight today had access to Instagram, you can bet he'd be posting close-ups of his gauntlets with captions like, "New pauldrons dropped feeling cute, might joust later." Personalisation began with simple adjustments, choosing a preferred helmet shape, selecting a certain type of pauldron, or adding extra ridges for flair, but it escalated rapidly. Soon knights were asking for custom-fitted cuirasses shaped to flatter the torso, vambraces engraved with personal mottos, and greaves with patterns copied from family tapestries. A suit of armour became as uniquely identifiable as a fingerprint, except fingerprints don't cost as much as a cathedral roof. Some knights personalised their armour for purely aesthetic reasons. They wanted their armour to shimmer, stand out, and announce their presence like a metallic trumpet blast. Bluing, gilding, silver inlays, and coloured lacquers allowed for dramatic contrasts. A fully blackened suit with gold filigree looked like something a medieval superhero would wear. A silver-polished suit, etched with flowers, signalled refinement. A crimson-accented breastplate? That usually meant, I want everyone here to know I'm dangerous and fashionable. Others used personalisation for storytelling. Armour became a biography in steel. A knight who had travelled widely might decorate his suit with motifs from different regions. Italian scrollwork, German fluting, French fleur-de-lis patterns. A crusader might request engraved scenes from Jerusalem, or crosses along the helmet rim. Veterans added symbols of their victories, broken lances, captured standards, beasts they claimed to have slain, though medieval knights exaggerated often enough that some of these beasts probably never existed outside their imagination. There were even humorous touches. Some helmets were shaped into snarling faces or bizarre expressions, giving the wearer a permanent, resting battle face. Certain nobles added tiny jokes or hidden symbols only visible up close, the medieval version of an inside joke sewn into a luxury jacket. Functionally, personalization also meant optimization. Knights modified joints for mobility, added reinforcing plates for preferred fighting styles, or requested custom gauntlets designed for their grip. It was fashion meeting engineering, ego meeting craftsmanship. By the 15th century, a knight's armour wasn't just something he wore. It was a statement, a story, a legacy, and sometimes a little flex. By the end of the Middle Ages, armour had risen far beyond its original purpose. What started as protective gear for warriors evolved into a full-fledged artistic tradition, one that blended metallurgy, aesthetics, engineering, heraldry, and unabashed ego. Even after gunpowder made plate armour increasingly obsolete on the battlefield, the idea of armour as fashion never died. Instead, it migrated into culture, ceremony, symbolism, and later into entertainment and imagination. The Renaissance courts preserved armour's artistic prestige. Monarchs like Maximilian I and Charles V continued commissioning highly ornate suits long after they stopped wearing them in real combat. These armours became propaganda tools, gallery pieces, and diplomatic symbols, proof that armour had transcended warfare. It wasn't equipment anymore. It was visual rhetoric. A king wearing gilded armour wasn't preparing for a fight. He was performing authority, projecting legitimacy, and reminding everyone in the room who held the budget for all this gold leaf collectors, and nobility in later centuries treated armour like fine art, displaying it in halls, museums, and private collections. Some families kept ceremonial suits that had never even seen a battlefield, preserving them as heritage objects. These pieces were as much about lineage as portraits or statues, frozen monuments to medieval craftsmanship, and the desire to look impressive while avoiding being stabbed. Armour's fashion legacy also lives on in unexpected ways. Modern military uniforms, parade dress, and even police ceremonial gear borrow heavily from the aesthetics of medieval plate epaulettes, crests, braiding, polished metal. All these echo the visual language created centuries earlier. Whenever a ceremonial guard today stands proudly in gleaming regalia, they're reenacting a tradition born from medieval knights who wanted to look stylish while riding past an audience. And then there's popular culture. Fantasy films, video games, and novels have embraced armour as a central visual motif. From heroic breastplates to villainous spikes to ornate elven suits, the medieval tradition of making armour beautiful has become a foundation of modern storytelling. Artists still draw inspiration from Gothic fluting, Milanese curves, and Maximilian ridging. Proof that the medieval armourer's imagination continues to shape aesthetics long after swords stopped being the preferred dispute resolution method. Ultimately, the legacy of medieval armour proves something deeply human. Even in an age defined by violence, people wanted beauty. They wanted identity. They wanted flair. And so they turned cold steel into art. Not because they had to, but because they could. Armour protected their bodies. Fashion immortalised their stories. A noble Egyptian feast did not simply happen. It unfolded like a ritual drama, with every stage orchestrated days in advance to impress guests, honour ancestors, and remind everyone present that the host possessed both wealth and divine favour. Before a single fig was sliced or a single jug of lotus wine was uncorked, the estate transformed into a buzzing organism. Part palace, part kitchen, part temple, servants were the first to move. At dawn, they swept courtyards, polished limestone floors, and hung garlands of lotus blossoms, whose sweet smell drifted through the halls. The scent wasn't just decoration. Lotus symbolized rebirth and divine purity, a subtle message that this meal would be far more meaningful than a simple dinner. In storerooms, other servants inspected amphorae filled with beer, wine, date syrup, or spiced oils. They tapped jars, listened for hollow tones, and checked seals to make sure nothing had spoiled hospitality was sacred. Serving stale pomegranate wine to high-ranking guests was a social crime. In the outer kitchens, teams of cooks began working through mountains of ingredients brought from farms, markets, and the estate's own gardens. Figs were sorted for softness, dates were split and stuffed with nuts, and baskets of grapes were rinsed in cool water from the household well. Honey jars were warmed so the rich golden sweetness would flow easily when drizzled over pastries or mixed into sauces. The air filled with the aroma of roasting goose, crackling fat, and freshly baked barley bread. Kitchens grew hot, crowded, and noisy, but everything moved with disciplined rhythm. These cooks weren't simply feeding people, they were preparing an edible display of status. But food wasn't the only priority. Musicians arrived to rehearse harp melodies and flute harmonies that would fill the evening with elegance. Scribes reviewed guest lists, ensuring everyone was seated according to rank, because placing someone even slightly below their expected position could ignite a feud lasting generations. Servants laid out cosmetic palettes and scented oils, ready to anoint guests the moment they walked through the villa's grand doors. Beyond the bustle, the noble host oversaw the preparations like a pharaoh in miniature. They selected which heirlooms to display, which ancestors' statues to honour at the feast, and which rare foods, honey cakes, exotic fish, imported wine, would send the clearest message: this house is blessed, wealthy, and favoured by the gods. A feast, after all, was not just a meal. It was a performance. Before a single bite of food reached the lips of Egypt's elite, the setting itself had to speak. A noble feast was as much about the environment as the dishes. The Egyptians believed beauty, order, and harmony reflected Ma'at, the cosmic balance that governed everything from the rising of the Nile to the beating of a human heart. So the host did not simply arrange a dining area. They curated an atmosphere worthy of gods, royalty, and ancestors. Most feasts took place in large open courtyards or lush garden pavilions, where the evening breeze softened the heat of the day. Servants tended to pools filled with water lilies and lotus flowers, their petals opening as the sun lowered behind palm groves. These pools were more than decoration. The reflection of torchlight dancing on water was believed to echo the shimmering fields of the afterlife. When nobles reclined nearby, they were symbolically sitting on the edge of eternity, a poetic reminder that life's pleasures were fleeting, sacred, and meant to be savoured. Around the courtyard, columns painted with bright pigments displayed scenes of gods offering protection. Blue ceilings imitated the night sky, sprinkled with tiny golden stars. Furniture was arranged thoughtfully. Low tables for food, carved wooden chairs for honoured guests, and cushioned mats for others to recline upon. Every angle of the space had to impress the moment a guest walked in. Egyptian nobles adored symmetry, and their feasting spaces reflected this obsession. A misplaced cushion or unevenly spaced jar wasn't simply sloppy, it was a disruption of cosmic order. Lighting played a crucial role. Servants placed oil lamps in strategic corners, while taller bronze stands held torches that flickered dramatically. The glow softened the stone walls and gave the room an almost dreamlike haze. Shadows danced across painted murals of feasting scenes, as if ancestors themselves were gathering alongside the living. Even the scents were crafted intentionally. Incense burners released swirls of frankincense and myrrh, believed to cleanse the space and attract divine attention. Combined with the fragrance of lotus petals, roasted meats, and honey-glazed pastries cooling nearby, the air became a sensory tapestry, inviting, indulgent, and slightly otherworldly. Before the feast began, the host walked the space one final time. They checked the placement of fruit bowls, adjusted torches, straightened garlands, and ensured the pathway to the ancestor shrine was clear. Everything needed to be perfect, not simply for prestige, but because Egyptians believed the gods themselves might wander through the celebration. And if the divine were watching, nothing less than perfection would do. A feast among Egyptian nobles truly began long before the first tray of roasted goose left the kitchen. It started with the arrival of the guests, a slow, elegant procession of elites who treated the simple act of showing up like a ritual of beauty, hierarchy, and quiet competition. After all, part of the evening's entertainment was seeing who looked the most radiant, who wore the finest linen, and who had spent a small fortune on cosmetic oils that smelled like paradise in jar form. Guests prepared meticulously. Hours before sunset, noble men and women bathed in perfumed water infused with lotus petals. They exfoliated with natron salts, smoothing their skin to the softness of polished alabaster cosmetics, were not optional. They were essential. Eyes were lined with thick kohl that protected against the sun and gave everyone an air of hypnotic mystery. Women applied red ochre to their lips, while men scented their chests with blends of myrrh and cinnamon oils. Even hairstyles spoke volumes: tight braids, golden beads, and elaborate wigs that could weigh as much as a newborn calf. When they finally arrived at the villa, the procession was intentionally slow. Guests approached the courtyard through decorated gateways, hung with palm fronds and lotus garlands. Servants greeted them with shallow bowls of fragrant water so they could wash their hands and feet. This wasn't about hygiene alone. It symbolized leaving the dust of the mortal world behind and entering a sacred space of abundance. Clothing mattered tremendously. The wealthiest nobles wore linen so sheer and finely woven it floated like smoke. Some garments were pleated into precise zigzags that required hours of careful folding, and starching jewellery glittered on wrists, ankles and throats. Gold bangles, faience beads, lapis lazuli amulets shaped like scarabs or ankhs. These weren't simply accessories. They were protective charms, status symbols, and conversation starters. A single gold collar could say more about a family's fortune than any speech. Once inside, every guest performed a ritual greeting. They bowed before household shrines, murmured blessings to the ancestors, and offered short prayers for prosperity. Hosts welcomed each person personally, a moment for subtle flattery and for rivals to scan each other's outfits. Social ranking determined where everyone reclined later, and experienced nobles could sense exactly how the seating would unfold just by observing the host's tone. With the courtyard glowing, the air fragrant, and guests shimmering like walking jewellery displays, the stage was finally set. The feast could begin, and appearances already told half the story. If the guests were the jewels of the evening, then the food was the crown. Lavish, abundant, and deliberately excessive. A noble Egyptian feast was not simply a meal, it was a staged performance of wealth, agricultural power, and the blessings of the gods. The moment servants brought out the first trays, conversations quieted, jaws loosened, and even the most stoic aristocrats could not help but admire the sheer spectacle of abundance. The centerpiece was always the roasted goose. Geese were a symbol of prosperity, and a perfectly roasted bird, skin crackling, juices dripping, seasoned with coriander, garlic, and a glaze of honey, signaled that the host had both means and excellent taste. The aroma alone spread through the courtyard like a divine announcement. In some estates, whole ducks, quail, or pigeons joined the goose, arranged in decorative patterns that looked too beautiful to eat. Though nobody hesitated for long, fruits were equally magnificent. Bowls overflowed with figs soft enough to collapse under a thumb, clusters of grapes still cool from the shade, and baskets of dates stuffed with crushed nuts, pomegranates, the ruby-red symbols of life and rebirth, were sliced open so their jewel-like seeds glistened in the lamplight. Children believed the gods hid blessings in every seed. Adults believed the same, but pretended it was just a tradition. Sweetness was a mark of wealth. Honey, precious and difficult to produce, coated pastries, flavoured sauces, and dripped generously over fruit nobles favoured honey-flavoured cakes, shaped like animals or lotus flowers, the surface golden and glossy. The sweet dish was more than pleasure. It was a sign that the household could afford the finest ingredients the Nile Valley offered. Vegetables and breads filled the gaps. Loaves of barley bread were baked into animal shapes or braided twists, their crusts sprinkled with sesame or flaxseed. Lentils, chickpeas, cucumbers, leeks, and radishes were served in bowls carved from alabaster or polished wood. Even simple dips like hummus-like bean pastes were elevated with herbs and oils to remind guests that nothing served here was ordinary. And then there were the drinks. Wine infused with lotus petals, spiced date wine, and the finest beers brewed from emmer wheat circulated freely. Servants kept cups full, a sign of respect to the living and the dead who were honoured that night. Before a single toast was made, the banquet already told a story. This house thrives. This family is blessed. And tonight, every guest will feast like the gods themselves. If food anchored a noble Egyptian feast, the drinks elevated it into something transcendent. Egyptians did not merely sip wine or beer for refreshment. Beverages were vessels of ritual, celebration, sensuality, and spiritual meaning. At a noble banquet, the moment a servant lifted a jug and poured the first cup, the evening transformed into an offering not just for the guests, but for the gods, ancestors, and unseen spirits who were believed to mingle among the living. The star of the banquet was lotus wine. More than a drink, it was a symbol of divine rebirth. The lotus flower closed at night and opened with the morning sun, mirroring the cycle of life, death, and resurrection. Steeping lotus petals in wine infused it with a subtle floral aroma and a faint blue tint, a visual reminder of the sacred river that sustained Egypt. Nobles sipped it slowly, letting its sweetness roll across the tongue, savouring the notion that each mouthful carried a whisper of cosmic renewal. Egyptians also experimented with flavoured wines. Pomegranate wine was tart and vibrant, with a deep ruby colour that glowed under torchlight. Date wine offered rich caramel notes, thick and almost syrupy, a favourite among older aristocrats who claimed it soothed the spirit. Some wines were infused with herbs, coriander, cinnamon, or desert mint, creating blends that danced between medicinal and indulgent beer, however remained the heartbeat of Egyptian drinking culture. Brewed from emmer wheat or barley, noble beer was nothing like its everyday counterpart drunk by workers. It was smoother, richer, filtered more carefully, and often flavoured with honey or spices. Beer symbolised nourishment and abundance, a drink of the earth, crafted from the grains that flowed from the Nile's annual floods. At feasts, servants refilled beer cups as attentively as wine goblets, ensuring no guest ever experienced the indignity of an empty vessel. Drinking itself followed ritual etiquette. Guests raised cups to honour ancestors. They poured a few drops on the ground for the spirits. They toasted the gods, Hathor, the goddess of joy and music, and Osiris, lord of rebirth, were especially honoured in drinking rites. The belief was simple. If the living feasted joyfully, the dead rejoiced with them. As music swelled and conversations deepened, the drinks loosened hierarchies just enough for laughter to rise and stories to flow. In those moments, glasses glowing in lamplight, petals floating on wine, the feast blurred the boundary between earthly pleasure and divine blessing. As the feast unfolded, the atmosphere transformed into something far more than a meal. It became a sensory performance. Music and dance were not simple entertainment in ancient Egypt. They were sacred arts believed to please gods, honour ancestors, and bind the living in joy and harmony. For nobles, a feast without music would have felt as empty as a banquet table without bread. Musicians entered the courtyard with quiet confidence, carrying harps taller than a child, delicate flutes carved from reed, and small hand drums that could produce rhythms sharp enough to stir even the most stoic state official. These musicians weren't background performers. They were respected artisans, often trained from childhood to master the subtle emotional language of Egyptian music. A single harp note could signal celebration or longing. A shift in rhythm from the sistrum, the sacred rattle associated with the goddess Hathor, could turn the entire feast from casual conversation to spiritual revelry. Hathor's presence hovered over the evening like a warm breeze. She was the goddess of beauty, dance, music, and joy, the patron deity of celebration. Many feasts included dancers who invoked her through movement. These dancers were highly skilled, their bodies adorned with gold beads, slender anklets, and perfumed oils that caught the lamplight as they moved. Their choreography blended sensuality with elegance, slow, fluid arm motions like rippling water, precise footwork mirroring the rhythm of drums, and soft body undulations inspired by the graceful movements of the Nile itself. The audience didn't just watch. They became part of the performance. Guests swayed gently with the rhythm, snapped fingers to the beat, or murmured blessings as a dancer passed by. Some nobles invited dancers to perform near ancestor shrines, believing the departed would enjoy the music just as much as the living. Even small gestures, like clapping in time or whispering praise to Hathor, were considered acts of devotion. Between dances, musicians shifted melodies to guide the emotional arc of the night. Bright, lively rhythms accompanied the serving of new dishes. Softer tones signaled conversations drifting towards storytelling or flirtation. Loud drum bursts announced the arrival of prestigious guests or the unveiling of a particularly extravagant dish. By the height of the evening, music and dance had woven themselves into the feast like threads of gold in a linen garment. The courtyard pulsed with sound, movement, and laughter, a living testament to the Egyptian belief that joy itself was a sacred offering. Behind every splendid Egyptian banquet stood an army of highly trained servants whose work was as critical as the host's status or the musician's skill. A noble feast was a carefully choreographed ritual, and the servants, cooks, cupbearers, dancers, attendants, incense bearers, and overseers performed it with precision. Their movements had to be silent enough not to disturb guests, yet efficient enough to keep the flow of the evening seamless. The moment guests reclined on cushioned mats or ivory-inlaid chairs, servants stepped into motion like gears in a divine machine. Cupbearers circulated with jugs of lotus wine and spiced beer, always approaching from the left and always bowing before refilling a cup. Their task wasn't simply to pour drinks. It was to ensure no guest ever felt neglected. A noble allowing a cup to remain empty signalled disrespect, and servants knew this unspoken rule as well as any priest knew sacred texts. Food servers appeared in disciplined lines, carrying trays of honeyed pastries, roasted meats, figs, cucumbers, and delicately prepared stews. Each tray was presented with a slight tilt, so the lamplight reflected off the food, making it visually irresistible. Servants alternated between passing dishes and pausing to describe ingredients or origins. Dates from the Fayum, honey from temple hives, fish brought this morning from the delta. This wasn't small talk. It was culinary storytelling meant to highlight the host's reach and resources. Certain rituals elevated the feast from social event to sacred moment. Before major dishes were served, incense bearers walked a slow circuit around the courtyard, releasing spirals of frankincense and myrrh. The scent was believed to attract benevolent spirits and purify the atmosphere. Guests lifted their heads slightly as the smoke passed, a subtle acknowledgement of the unseen world participating in the feast. Hand-washing attendants were equally important. Between courses, they knelt before guests with alabaster bowls filled with scented water. Drops of lotus oil floated on the surface, releasing fragrance as guests dipped their fingertips. The attendants dried hands with soft linen cloths, then stepped away with a bow. These gestures symbolized renewal, gratitude, and the host's commitment to Mawat, the cosmic harmony governing Egyptian life. Even entertainment relied on precise teamwork. Musicians signaled attendance before switching rhythms so dancers could enter at the perfect moment. Storytellers waited for servers to finish passing dishes before beginning dramatic recitations. By the height of the evening, the servants' choreography was so fluid that the feast felt effortless, though every effortless moment was built on months of training and centuries of tradition. In their skill, the household revealed its true sophistication. Once the food flowed, the music swelled, and the wine loosened stiff shoulders, the true purpose of an Egyptian noble feast revealed itself: conversation. These gatherings were not just places to indulge the senses. They were arenas for diplomacy, networking, subtle competition, and social maneuvering. A feast might look like a relaxed celebration, but beneath the laughter, every word carried weight. Nobles reclined on cushioned mats or carved wooden chairs, leaning toward one another as they exchanged greetings that sounded polite, but often hid layers of meaning. A compliment on someone's linen wasn't just about fashion. It acknowledged their wealth. Admiring a guest's jewellery was a nod to their family's influence. Even the way one greeted the host said everything about political allegiances. Egyptians were masters of elegance, but also masters of reading between the lines. The conversations drifted fluidly between topics. Some nobles spoke of the Nile's flood levels, which determined the kingdom's agricultural prosperity. Others discussed temple festivals, recent court events, or rumours swirling around the pharaoh's advisors. A feast was the perfect setting to test opinions, float proposals, or gauge support. If a noble wanted to advance a son into priesthood or secure a marriage alliance, the banquet offered fertile ground for quiet negotiation. Flirtation also played its role. Perfumes, coal-lined eyes, and the glow of lamplight gave the evening a sensual undertone. Elegant gestures, a shared cup of wine, a whispered joke, a longer-than-usual glance, could spark connections or ignite rivalries. Egyptian poetry often praised the power of a feast's romantic tension, the way beauty mingled with music to stir the heart like a lotus blooming at dusk. Storytelling added another layer of social play. Elders recounted tales of heroic ancestors, successful harvests, or divine encounters, subtly reminding listeners of their family's prestige. Younger nobles shared humorous anecdotes or exaggerated stories of travels, hoping to impress. A well-timed story could elevate a person's standing. A poorly delivered one could sink it. Everyone knew the stakes. Meanwhile, scribes and high-ranking officials used the relaxed atmosphere to observe alliances forming or fracturing. Hosting a feast wasn't just hospitality. It was a political declaration. The guest list alone revealed who was rising, who was fading, and who enjoyed the host's favour. Through all this, guests remained outwardly calm and graceful. Egyptian nobility valued poise, even when the stakes were high. Cups clinked, laughter rose, dancers swayed, and beneath the surface the currents of power shifted quietly. A feast fed the body, but conversation fed ambition. As the night deepened and the final plates of honey cakes and fig pastries disappeared, the tone of the feast began to shift. What had started as a display of wealth, hospitality, and social grace slowly transformed into something more intimate and spiritual. Ancient Egyptians did not separate the sacred from the everyday, especially not during a banquet. To them, food, music, flowers, and laughter were not merely pleasures. They were offerings to the gods and tributes to the ancestors who shaped the family's destiny. When the musicians softened their melodies and dancers withdrew to rest, priests or respected elders approached the household shrine. These shrines, small altars dedicated to ancestors or protective deities, stood near the courtyard's edge, illuminated by flickering oil lamps. Trays of leftover fruits, bread, wine, and roasted meats were carried forward. Nothing was wasted. Everything had meaning. Presenting food to the spirits ensured they too shared in the abundance. Egyptians believed the dead continued to influence the fortunes of the living, and honouring them was essential for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic harmony. Guests watched reverently as incense bearers circled the shrine. Swirls of frankincense rose into the night air, carrying prayers upward. The scent blended with the fading aromas of roasted goose, lotus wine, and sweet pastries, a final sensory reminder of the feast's richness. Hands lifted in silent blessings. Some guests whispered personal prayers, asking for fertility, good harvests, successful journeys, or protection from illness. The banquet, which had begun as a social event, now felt like a communion with eternity. After the offering, the atmosphere lightened once again. Servants passed around fresh water for rinsing hands, a symbolic cleansing to close the evening guests. Their spirits warm with wine and contentment, resumed softer conversations. Laughter mellowed into storytelling, and many nobles praised the host's generosity, a gesture that carried political weight. Compliments exchanged at this late hour often blossomed into alliances, friendships, or advantageous agreements by morning. As the final lamps dimmed and guests began to depart, each person left carrying more than a full stomach. They carried memories, strengthened bonds, and the sense that they had participated in something larger than themselves. A noble feast was never just a night of indulgence. It was a renewal of social harmony, a reaffirmation of divine favour, and a reminder that life, like the lotus, was both fleeting and sacred. The courtyard quieted. The stars shimmered above the Nile, and in the peaceful afterglow, the household knew it had honoured gods, ancestors, and guests alike, fulfilling the timeless purpose of an Egyptian noble feast. Before the Odrysian kingdom emerged, Thrace was a world of raw beauty and raw danger, a frontier stretching from the Aegean Sea up to the Danube, filled with dense forests, roaring rivers, sacred mountains, and gold-bearing streams that glittered in the sun. To outsiders, Thrace looked like a wilderness. To the Thracians, it was a living, breathing force, a land that hardened those who lived upon it and rewarded those strong enough to dominate it. This land was not ruled by kings or cities, but by tribes, dozens of them. The Bessi held the mountain passes, whispering prophecies to Dionysian priests. The Tribali roamed the plains like wolves. The Getae prayed to Zalmoxis and believed death itself was merely a journey. And then there were the Odrysians, proud, ambitious, and already dreaming bigger than any of their neighbours. Each tribe had its own chieftain, its own customs, its own symbols, and above all, its own pride. The Thracians were feared across the ancient world for a reason. Greek writers described them as the most warlike of all people, and Persian kings valued them enough to recruit entire regiments into their armies. These warriors fought barefoot, sprinting across rocky terrain with impossible speed. They wielded curved swords, the deadly rhomphaea, that could split shields, helmets, and bone with terrifying precision. They decorated their bodies with tattoos, wore foxskin caps, and drank strong wine unmixed with water, something that never failed to horrify their more delicate Greek neighbours. But while Thrace overflowed with strength, it lacked unity. Every clan was independent, every chieftain suspicious of the others, and alliances dissolved faster than they formed. A tribe might be a fierce force on its own, but collectively they were scattered embers, bright, hot, but unable to blaze together. This political fragmentation made Thrace vulnerable to foreign manipulation. Greeks offered gifts to certain chieftains to gain access to mines. Persians bribed others to secure routes for their armies. Everyone wanted a piece of Thrace, but no tribe was strong enough to speak for all. Yet beneath this chaos, something was shifting. Trade routes expanded, gold flowed down the Hebrus River, horses were bred in astonishing numbers, and certain clans, especially the Odrysians, grew richer and more influential. The land was ripe for change, ripe for ambition, ripe for a leader powerful enough to fuse scattered clans into a kingdom. The embers were there, waiting. They only needed one man to ignite them. Into this fractured world stepped a man whose ambition far outpaced the borders of his tribe. Teres, son of the Odrysian lineage. History remembers him as the first great unifier of Thrace. But to understand his rise, you must picture the world he inherited. A labyrinth of feuding clan chiefs, raiding parties, blood feuds, and centuries of tribal pride that made unity seem impossible. And yet, Teres saw what no one else did. Thrace could be more than a collection of warriors. It could be a state, a kingdom, a power that even Persia and Athens would have to respect. Teres was not the typical Thracian chieftain who lived only for battle and plunder. He was a strategist, a negotiator, a diplomat in a world that barely understood diplomacy. He recognized that strength alone couldn't unify the tribes, at least not for long. What Thrace needed was a shared identity, shared wealth, and a shared future that promised more than endless fighting over grazing grounds and river crossings. His first step was forging alliances. Some he won with generosity, offering gold and horses, the two currencies most sacred to Thracian nobles. Others he won through marriages, binding powerful clans to his own bloodline. And some he subdued by force. Teres wasn't naive. He understood that unification required diplomacy in one hand, and the Romphaea in the other. The tribes who resisted him most fiercely soon realized that fighting Teres meant fighting every tribe he had already allied, a losing battle. With each new alliance, Teres strengthened his position. With each subdued rival, his prestige grew. Soon, he established something no Thracian leader had ever accomplished, a network of loyalty stretching across the plains and valleys of southeastern Europe. Tribes who had once raided each other for sport now found themselves contributing soldiers, wealth, and resources to a single rising power. The Odrysian kingdom in the making, Teres, also understood the importance of trade. He positioned his growing state along crucial routes linking the Danube to the Aegean, the Black Sea to the Macedonian world Greek colonies on the coast, which once dealt with individual tribes, now had to negotiate with a single Odrysian authority. That shift alone transformed the balance of power. By the time Teres declared himself king, the tribes were no longer scattered embers. They were a growing flame, united, directed, and fueled by shared ambition. And at its center stood Teres, the man who had turned a dream of unity into a political reality that would reshape the Balkans. A kingdom cannot rise without an army, and the Odrysian kingdom was built upon one of the most fearsome warrior cultures in the ancient world. Long before Teres unified the tribes, Thracian warriors were already the stuff of legend, swift, brutal, unpredictable, and unshakably loyal to their chieftains. Under Teres, however, this raw warrior tradition was sharpened, reorganized, and transformed into a formidable military force capable of challenging great powers. The core of the Odrysian army consisted of light infantry. These fighters had no interest in heavy armor. They relied on speed, agility, and the chaotic energy of tribal combat. Armed with javelins, crescent-shaped shields, and the deadly Romphaea, a curved blade that combined the reach of a spear with the chopping power of an axe, they charged into battle like a living storm. The Greeks, who prided themselves on discipline and phalanx formations, dreaded the moment a Thracian warrior broke through the lines. One swing of the Romphaea could cleave through a hoplite's shield and leave him exposed in an instant. Then came the horsemen. Thrace was famous for its horses, and the Odrysians used them with unmatched ferocity. Thracian cavalry didn't simply attack, they hunted. They rode bareback, leaning low over the horse's neck, loosing arrows with frightening precision, or swinging long spears from impossible angles. These horsemen were ghosts on the battlefield, appearing in a flash, striking with feral intensity, and vanishing before an organized counterattack could form. But Teres understood something the tribes had never fully mastered: discipline amplified power. He reorganized the warrior bands, creating a structure that blended tribal ferocity with coordinated tactics. Chiefs who once fought as independent raiders now led units integrated into a larger battle plan. Warriors who once charged out of instinct now charged on command. This shift didn't suppress their wildness, it weaponized it. The prestige of serving the Odrysian king grew rapidly. Warriors from distant tribes began seeking Odrysian banners, drawn by promises of plunder, gold, horses, and glory. Some came because the Odrysians offered something rare in Thracian culture, a stable state where a warrior could rise through merit. Not just lineage foreign powers took notice. Persian satraps hired Thracians as elite mercenaries. Greek generals dreaded facing them. Even Macedonian kings admired their ferocity under Teres. The Thracian warrior stopped being a tribal fighter and became something new. A soldier of a kingdom, a symbol of unity, and the sharpened edge of the first organized state in the Balkans. Power in the ancient world was not sustained by warriors alone. Behind every ambitious king stood the wealth to arm, feed, reward, and impress. And the Odrysian kingdom was born in one of the richest regions of the Balkans. Teres understood this better than any leader before him. If he wanted to transform scattered tribes into a unified state, he needed more than alliances. He needed an economic foundation sturdy enough to hold the kingdom together. Thrace was blessed with gold. Not mythical stories, but real veins and riverbeds glittering with dust and nuggets. The Hebrus River, flowing through Odrysian lands, carried precious gold deposits that locals collected in woven pans. Greek merchants had long coveted Thracian gold, but once Teres began consolidating territory, access to these deposits came under royal control. The king could now negotiate trade agreements from a position of strength, exchanging gold for bronze weaponry, fine pottery, luxury goods, and political favour. Next came the horses, one of Thrace's greatest treasures. The plains and foothills produced strong, agile horses that Greeks praised as some of the finest in the region. The Odrysians bred them carefully, valuing endurance, speed, and war readiness. Horses were not mere animals, they were wealth incarnate. A noble's prestige was measured not by how much land he owned, but by how many horses grazed in his fields. When Teres offered horses as diplomatic gifts or payment to foreign mercenaries, he wasn't being generous. He was showcasing power. Trade routes expanded as the kingdom grew. Teres secured control over the road networks linking the interior with Greek coastal cities like Apollonia, Thasos, and Byzantium. These routes brought in amphorae of wine, olive oil, fine textiles, weaponry, and luxury items meant to impress tribal leaders and reinforce royal authority. In return, the Odrysians exported furs, honey, timber, slaves, and above all, gold and horses. Greek traders flocked to Odrysian markets, eager to bargain for Thracian goods and curry favour. With the rising power, Teres also imposed a form of tribute, a revolutionary concept in Thrace. Instead of random raids and chaotic plunder, tribes now paid structured taxes in livestock, grain, warriors, or precious metals. This income allowed the king to reward allies, maintain a standing force, and hold lavish feasts that reinforced loyalty. Through economic strength, Teres achieved what brute force never could: stability. The Odrysian kingdom became more than a military confederation. It became an economic powerhouse that rivaled its Greek and Persian neighbours. And with wealth flowing steadily into royal coffers, Teres was finally able to turn his attention toward the wider world. As Teres forged the Odrysian kingdom into a unified and wealthy state, he found himself standing between two giants, the Achaemenid Persian Empire to the east and the fiercely competitive Greek city-states to the south. Thrace had always been a crossroads, but now that crossroads became a battlefield of influence, bribes, alliances, and threats, and Teres, far from being intimidated, began playing the diplomatic game with the skill of a seasoned strategist. For decades, Persia treated Thrace as a frontier territory ripe for manipulation. Darius and later Xerxes had marched their armies through Thracian lands, forcing tribes to submit or provide troops many chieftains yielded, because they had little choice. But Terese changed the equation. Instead of resisting blindly or grovelling, he negotiated. He recognized that Persia respected strength, not flattery, so he offered what Persia valued most: warriors. Thracian fighters served as elite mercenaries in Persian campaigns, earning fame and gold across Asia Minor. But Terese never allowed this relationship to become subjugation. He gave just enough cooperation to avoid invasion. While keeping the Odrysian heartland firmly independent, Persia saw him as useful. Terese saw Persia as temporary. The Greeks were more complicated. On one hand, Greek commerce enriched the Odrysian treasury. On the other, Greek politics resembled a pot about to boil over at any moment. Athens, Sparta, Thasos, Macedon all wanted influence in Thrace, and none could tolerate the idea of a united, powerful kingdom controlling the northern trade routes. Terese responded with a simple but brilliant strategy: play them against each other. When Athens wanted Thracian grain and horse exports, he obliged, but at a price. When Thasos tried to interfere with coastal trade, he pressured them through inland routes. When Macedon grew too bold, he supported their rivals. He even accepted Greek ambassadors with lavish hospitality, all while quietly expanding his influence deeper into the Balkans. The key to his diplomacy was unpredictability. Terese aligned with neither camp fully. Thrace under Terese was too valuable to antagonize and too strong to bully Greeks, quickly learned that attacking Odrysian territory risked triggering a cascade of tribal retaliation. Persians understood that pushing too far could unite the clans under Terese in a war of resistance. Surrounded by superpowers, Terese did the impossible. He kept Thrace free. By balancing the ambitions of foreigners, selling Thracian strength without selling Thracian soul, and exploiting every rivalry to his advantage, he ensured the Odrysian kingdom rose not as a pawn, but as a player. While Greek writers fixated on Thracian warriors, the Odrysian kingdom was far more complex than raids and Rhomphaea strikes. Under Terese, a vibrant royal court emerged, a world of feasts, sacred rituals, diplomacy, and elite culture that impressed even the most jaded foreign visitors. This court became the beating heart of Odrysian power, the place where loyalty was forged, alliances strengthened, and the identity of the kingdom reshaped. Odrysian feasts were legendary, celebrated with a fervour that blended celebration, politics, and spiritual significance. These gatherings were not polite Greek symposia. They were thunderous, extravagant affairs where gold cups clinked, horsemen boasted of victories, poets recited tribal histories, and kings displayed wealth in the most unmistakable way possible. Generosity, serving abundant food, roasted boar, venison, bread baked with honey, cheeses, and river fish, was a king's obligation. The Thracians believed that a generous ruler was favoured by the gods, while a stingy one was cursed. Wine flowed in enormous quantities, but unlike Greek customs, Dionysian drinking rules barely applied here. Thracians drank their wine unmixed, potent and fiery, believing water diluted the soul. Yet these feasts were not reckless chaos. They were social theatres, where the king recognised loyal chiefs, distributed gifts, reaffirmed tribal bonds, and settled disputes. A well-timed gift, perhaps a horse of exceptional breeding, a cloak trimmed with fox fur, or a gold torque, could transform a rival into an ally. Religion intertwined seamlessly with politics. The Odrysians honoured deities shared across Thrace, the Great Rider, the Mother Goddess, and Zalmoxis. A mysterious figure worshipped as a divine master of life and death. Priests and shamans played key roles in royal ceremonies. Before any major decision, the court performed rituals involving sacred fires, sacrifices, and omens read from horse entrails or eagle flight patterns. These rituals had one purpose: to confirm that the gods endorsed the king's choices. The royal court also became a diplomatic stage. Greek envoys, Macedonian nobles, and Persian agents visited the Odrysian capital, astonished by its wealth. They found carved wooden halls decorated with animal motifs, treasures made of gold and silver, and nobles draped in patterned cloaks and elaborate jewellery. Music echoed through the halls, flutes, lyres, and drums, accompanied by dances that blended athleticism with tribal symbolism. In this court, the Odrysian kingdom transformed from a military confederation into a cultural power. Teres understood that a kingdom survived not only by the sword, but by giving its people something worth fighting for: identity, pride, and shared purpose. When Teres unified the Thracian tribes, he did something no leader in the region had ever attempted. He transformed the raw, untamed energy of countless clans into a functioning political system. The Odrysian kingdom was not just a gathering of chiefs under a powerful warlord. It was the first organized state in the Balkans, complete with a royal hierarchy, administrative networks, and mechanisms of control that distinguished it from every tribal structure that came before. At the top sat the king, not merely a chieftain, but a ruler with authority recognized across hundreds of miles. Terraces, halls, and sacred groves served as royal centers where the king held court, issued commands, received envoys, and settled disputes. Kingship in Thrace was not inherited automatically. It was reinforced constantly through displays of strength, wealth, generosity, and divine legitimacy. The king was expected to be the best warrior, the most generous host, and the wisest negotiator, a blend of hero, priest, and judge. To govern effectively, Teres built a network of loyal nobles who served as regional governors. These were not bureaucrats in the Greek sense. They were powerful tribal lords bound by oath, marriage, and gifts. In exchange for prestige and wealth, they collected tribute, raised troops, controlled trade routes, and ensured that the king's authority reached far beyond the palace walls. Tribute formed the backbone of the Odrysian economy: grain, livestock, gold dust, furs, slaves, and above all, horses. These resources allowed the king to reward supporters, maintain warriors, and project royal power. Law in the Odrysian realm was not written, but it was understood. Much of it came from tradition, codes of honor, hospitality, and vengeance that Thracians had followed for centuries. But Teres elevated these customs by adding new expectations tied to the crown: loyalty to the king over one's own clan, obedience during campaigns, and punishment for betrayal. The Odrysians blended tradition with innovation, creating a system both familiar and transformative. Royal messengers, escorted by warriors, carried orders to distant territories. Chieftains sent back reports on raids, trade, and disputes. For the first time in Thracian history, tribes across vast regions were tied together by something stronger than rivalry. They were tied together by infrastructure. Roads were maintained, river routes protected, and safe passage guaranteed for merchants under royal protection. In a land once shaped by unpredictable alliances, the Odrysian kingdom created stability. Foreign powers recognized this transformation immediately. Greeks spoke of the king of the Thracians with a mixture of respect and fear. Persians acknowledged him as a distinct political force, not a mere tribal leader. Through structure, loyalty, and a new vision of kingship, Teres built more than a kingdom. He built the foundations of Balkan statehood. By the height of Teres's reign, the Odrysian kingdom was no longer a hopeful experiment. It had become a rising power with ambitions that stretched across the Balkans. What began as a unification of tribes transformed into a state capable of expanding its borders, projecting military might, and shaping regional politics. The 5th century BCE was the golden age of Odrysian power, a time when the kingdom reached from the Aegean coast to the mountains of Thrace, from the Black Sea to the upper valleys of the Hebrus. Expansion came through 3 methods: diplomacy, absorption, and when necessary, overwhelming force. Many tribes joined willingly, enticed by the wealth and protection the Odrysians offered. Others resisted, and were subdued in dramatic campaigns that became etched in Thracian oral history. Teres's armies swept across the plains and forests, their cavalry moving like a storm, their infantry advancing with the confidence of a kingdom backed by gold and unity. The message was clear: join or be forgotten. The kingdom grew not only in size, but in sophistication. Tribute from conquered or allied tribes poured into the Odrysian capital gold, livestock, horses, textiles, and skilled craftsmen enriched the royal court. Greek colonists on the coast, once accustomed to dealing with small, competitive tribes, now paid customs fees directly to Odrysian officials. These revenues fueled further expansion, better weapons, larger warrior bands, and lavish gifts that kept nobles loyal. One of Teres's greatest achievements was securing control over key trade corridors. The land routes linking the Danube to the Aegean passed through Odrysian hands. So did the river routes that fed goods into the Black Sea. This gave the kingdom leverage over Greek merchants, Persian envoys, and Macedonian warlords alike. When the Odrysians tightened their control, markets felt it. When they opened them, wealth flowed. Militarily, the Odrysians reached their zenith. Thracian cavalry became the terror of the borderlands, capable of shattering Greek formations or outrunning Persian detachments. Light infantry wielding the fearsome Rhomphaea patrolled frontier regions, enforcing order and crushing rebellion. The kingdom's emblem, a mounted warrior with a raised spear, became a symbol recognized from Byzantium to Pella. Even the Greeks, who rarely praised foreigners, acknowledged the Odrysian rise with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Herodotus wrote of the Thracians as a people who could dominate the world if only they were unified under Teres. That prophecy finally had weight. At its height, the Odrysian kingdom was more than a political entity. It was a cultural and military powerhouse, welded together by ambition, wealth, and a king who had turned a dream into a dynasty. When King Teresdai died, he left behind something unprecedented in the history of the Balkans, a unified, organized, and influential kingdom that endured long after his lifetime. His successors, most notably his son, Sitalces, expanded and refined what he had built. They strengthened diplomatic ties with Athens, extended the kingdom's borders deeper into the mountains and plains of Thrace, and positioned the Odrysians as indispensable players in the great political games of the 5th century BCE. Under Sitalces, the Odrysian kingdom reached its territorial peak. Tens of thousands of warriors marched under the royal banner, an army so large that even Athens, one of the naval superpowers of the ancient world, sought alliance rather than confrontation. When Sitalces launched his famous campaign into Macedon, the ground shook with the thunder of Thracian cavalry. Entire regions submitted out of sheer intimidation. The campaign ultimately stalled, but its message was unmistakable. Thrace was no longer a frontier, it was a power. The Odrysian kingdom also became a cultural nexus. Greek influence mingled with Thracian traditions, creating a unique hybrid that appeared in art, burial practices, weapon design, and royal ceremonies. Odrysian nobles decorated their tombs with lavish gold treasures, crowns shaped like laurel wreaths, drinking vessels carved with horsemen and gods, rhytons sculpted into lions and eagles. These artifacts, uncovered in modern Bulgaria, stand today as some of the greatest masterpieces of ancient European craftsmanship. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Odrysian kingdom was psychological. For the first time, the Thracians saw themselves not merely as tribes, but as a people belonging to a greater whole. Teres had proven that unity could bring prosperity, security, and influence. That idea outlived him. Even when the kingdom fractured in later centuries due to internal rivalries and foreign pressure, the memory of Thracian unity persisted. The Odrysians also reshaped how foreign powers viewed the region. No longer a chaotic hinterland of raiders and mercenaries, Thrace became a significant geopolitical factor. Persians negotiated with it. Greeks courted its kings. Macedonians feared and respected it. And when Philip II, father of Alexander the Great, rose in Macedon, he studied Thracian military traditions, adopted their cavalry tactics, and married into Thracian nobility. The Odrysian influence flowed directly into the empire, building strategies that would soon change the ancient world. By the time the kingdom eventually succumbed to Roman expansion centuries later, its impact had already been etched into Balkan history. The Odrysians created the first true state in the region, proved the power of unity among fierce tribes, and left behind golden treasures and heroic legends that still echo through the mountains of Thrace. The rise of the Odrysian kingdom was not just a political triumph. It was a cultural awakening, a military revolution, and the spark of statehood in southeastern Europe.